host, Jesse Chason, with Lisa Blanchard as the host of Airing Addiction.
I share often my journey started on this campus. Got sober as a client here, just like you.
I really do see phenomenal change.
Always hope. I've seen situations that on the surface look impossible, become possible.
Doing this podcast is to share those recovery stories, be honest about what the challenges are and have some real conversations, but kind of share that out on the airwaves.
Welcome everybody to week 2 of Recovery Month and the second installment of our weekly episodes of Airing Addiction. If you're listening live, it is the second week in September, and we are doing our usual weekly episodes to really celebrate recovery in Recovery Month. And just like last year, we're aligning kind of our topics with kind of what the federal government has kind of put out as theme weeks for Recovery Month and opportunities to share different aspects of addiction and recovery specifically. And so this week is actually home. And so we really were excited about bringing our guests on, which Jesse will introduce in just a minute. But really that goal of the focus of this week of Recovery Month is thinking about how safe, stable living environments really support recovery, right? And what that looks like. And one of the things that I'm particularly proud of at Spectrum and New England Recovery Center is that we really take that to heart, that we really consider, of course, last year we did some great conversations on housing, but part of home is the family and support system that you are going back to when you leave treatment or throughout treatment if it's outpatient or throughout your recovery process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jesse to introduce our fabulous guests.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Today we have Rose Gage, LMHC. She's the Family Engagement Specialist at New England Recovery Center. She has worked with individuals for over 20 years. Over 3 years, we have been happy to have her here at NERC. She enjoys working with the families and supporting the individuals. Certainly we'll get into family engagement as our conversation goes on. Something near and dear to my heart. I think I've shared on this podcast before. I enjoy Rose very much. We used to share an office together, which seems like many moons ago. And we also have Lynn LeBlanc-Marrone. She's the Executive Director of Inpatient and Outpatient Clinical Services for Spectrum Health Systems. She is a licensed mental health counselor as well, and a certified drug and alcohol counselor with over 40 years of clinical and supervisory experience. She also is one of the facilitators for Spectrum's Fast Magnolia team, which we certainly will do a deep dive into. I think today is only fitting with the theme of home. Lynn holds a master's degree in counseling from my alma mater, and I know Lisa's alma mater, Assumption College, now Assumption University, although they won't give us any of those updated degrees. Right. I've asked. So to start off our conversation, I'd love to hear from you, Rose. Anything about your work as a family engagement specialist, the driving force behind why you've been doing this work for so long, or any just insights into, I guess a good starting point would be to define family engagement for those that are listening that may not know exactly what we're talking about. So I will turn it over to you, Rose.
Well, thank you. So for me, we talk a lot about how addiction is a family disease. And as a result of that, we need to include those support systems in our patients' lives. And that is something that I think is very important as we talk about community, togetherness, healing. The family needs to heal together. So that's something that I have seen in my role that I really value, is bringing family members in to open the door to better communication and to start the healing process.
Lovely.
How do we define family? Does that have to be like your significant other, your parents? How do we approach kind of, who would you consider family?
So one of the things whenever I'm talking about family engagement in our groups, I always say that family is how you define it. And I will start that conversation with how people define family. And I have had sessions with people's sponsors, best friends, a variety of individuals, but anyone that can provide that support, that motivation, and that push while they're here. So I give them the opportunity to define what family means to them.
That's really important. That's a great point to bring up because, even though it's in the title family engagement, addiction being no respecter of persons. And I heard you say that, addiction is a family disease, which we all know, and the research backs it up. We get to choose our family, if you will, today in recovery. I think it's great that you've had conversations with sponsors because even those in recovery, myself included, can benefit from continued education and just learning about addiction as a disease. So I'm wondering if you could just give a brief overview for our listeners of what the practical family engagement role looks like if someone were to come into New England Recovery Center today, what to expect.
So I spend a lot of time, so I explain the process to our patients. And what I do is I usually spend about 45 minutes to an hour with individuals and get a sense of how they define family, what the strengths are about the family, what goals they have for the session. And oftentimes it's around issues like communication and explaining the process. So that's something that I spend a lot of time with is meeting individually with the person to also help them prepare for what the session will look like with that particular person. And then we also call that individual together and ask them what their goals are for the session, so that there are not surprises and so that they also feel invested in the process. Because I think first and foremost, it's also making sure that it's going to be a healthy conversation and not one that's going to be triggering. And sometimes patients will start talking about a relationship and will say to me, you know what, I don't think I want to talk with this person right now. I don't think it will be healthy. So that leads to a different conversation sometimes with how we can work to start improving that relationship.
Lynn, I'd love to hear from your perspective. Not at all, it's hard to believe you're in the field for 40 years. I've known you for probably close to half of that, but you've seen a real evolution over time in how the addiction field approaches engaging families and supports. And I'd love to hear kind of how you developed your strong interest in family support as part of the treatment process and kind of how you've seen it evolve over time.
Sure. So yes, 40 years is a long time. But even in grad school, actually my concentration was in family systems. So I just happened to have my first job came in a treatment and at the time it was initially primarily alcohol use. And later cocaine got really mixed in. But in those early years, my approach was very family centered. However, the field also had a real push for family work. So that would have been, in the 80s, a lot had surfaced around the family disease at that time. And a big chunk of it was Claudia Black and a lot of the pioneers at the time that started addressing the family. Claudia Black's book, It Will Never Happen to Me, really, talked about that growing up in a family system and saying, I'm never going to do that, but how it still impacted. So the program I worked in, there was a lot on adult children of alcoholics, and that's the terminology that would have been used at that time. We would, talk much more about individuals with, a substance use disorder now. But at that time, we focused a lot of bringing the family in. I did lots of couples work and lots of full family work at the time, and really saw a lot of the benefits of including family in. And if I could, and I haven't even had a chance to tell Lisa this, I had a discussion with a longtime friend at lunch the other day, and she had worked with me in those early days, and she ran a Children of Alcoholics group at the time. And she said to me, I was just visiting a family member who was in the hospital. And she said, this nurse came in and looked familiar to me. And the nurse kept saying, boy, you look familiar to me too. And they're having this discussion. And where it came up was when this nurse was 16 years old, she attended this group. And she said to her, I can't tell you how much that impacted my life and how I move forward from where I was as a teenager in a situation I couldn't control. And just thank you for that. And that literally, I just got that story a week ago. And just that impact that families have where we would talk to is that even if you can't control everything around you, what we want is to know that you can continue to move forward. And that was the theme, because it's out of your control. But what can I do to stay healthy, to stay well, and to move forward? So the importance for me has always been there. For the patient, it really does help retain them in treatment. It might help initiate treatment, and for the family, it can validate, where they're feeling and how we can promote self-care. But somewhere along the line, that seemed to drop off a bit. And later in my career, though I enjoyed working with couples and things like that, at times I would certainly bring people in. But I think perhaps as the opioid, crisis really started hitting, the volume of serving the patient, at least on the outpatient basis, became very focused on the patient and sometimes less so on the full family system. There seemed to be a bit of a switch. And I think we're now seeing how important it is to include family members in whenever possible. And certainly at New England Recovery, where Jesse and Rose have had that position, we have really seen the benefits and continue to want to expand that over time. So certainly, and I want to go back to that statement of we're also looking at family on however that person identifies family. And that wasn't always the case in the early years. It really kind of focused on the traditional family. And I would say now we have a way more inclusive view of who any particular individual identifies as their support and family.
In some ways, I feel like there was this real focus on being person-centered, right? And so
Yes.
I think that led to some of this shift on focusing on the patient, on what do you need? How can we help you? How can you work towards recovery in a very self-directed way? And we still are, right? I'm
Right.
still conducting trainings where we're talking about being person-centered. We're still evolving our systems to be even more person-centered. That's why the person-centered language. Thanks for highlighting the changes that have happened over time. But I think that there's, can be a disconnect from being person-centered doesn't mean outside of their environment, right? So that the environment that they lived in and grew up in and potentially came into addiction in matters. The environment that they are going back to or staying in while working towards or in recovery matters, right? That person doesn't mean just the person. It means the person and those around them, their environment, right? We talk a lot about all of the things that impact recovery, and a lot of them are environmental, right? It could be housing, it could be, employment or volunteer, it could be community, right? And sometimes that's where chosen family is found, is within community. And that all is part of person-centered care, right? Is recognizing who else and where else, is that person existing in. Because if you just work on yourself and you go back to your environment, and nothing has changed there, right? We often see not as great recovery outcomes. Can we talk a little bit about if we don't include families or support persons, like what can happen?
I could certainly give an example of that in working with outpatient. What we found was with younger individuals who were still on their parents' insurance, for example. So at an opiate treatment program, what we were finding is some of these younger folks, because early on, in those early stages, they needed to come daily for their medication to be dispensed. They were often getting rides from family members. And what you saw was sometimes the person saying, I got to get off of this as soon as possible. My parents are having a difficult time with bringing me here every day. They keep asking me, why do you have to do this? And we could see it as a potential issue. And that's where we started involving family. And so, I conducted some meetings and invited family members in, and they all had the same questions. Why is it that my kid has to come here every day? Why is their medication at this amount? When can they come off of this? And what we found is when you sat, answered questions, which became very similar week to week, they had the same questions, they started saying, oh, I understand more now. This makes more sense to me. And even coming within the building, that seemed probably scary to them, right? They said, oh, this is kind of like a medical office, and that's what you wanted people to be able to see. And what you found is if the family is on board with helping and supporting this and knows the why to it, we were able then to retain more of this younger 20s kind of group once their family understood the process and why it was happening. So there's one right there of, if the family sees the purpose, then the individual might stay in treatment longer.
Right.
That's a great point, Lynn. And if I could just interject here for a moment, and just talk about the connection between families, and certainly not to toot our own horn at Spectrum Health Systems and New England Recovery Center. There are plenty of great treatment programs around that do a phenomenal job of including families at all levels of care, from inpatient to outpatient and everywhere in between. However, I remember, well, just for those that are listening that maybe, found this podcast recently or whatnot, Rose and I share a special bond because we both have been the family engagements specialist at New England Recovery Center at various times, and our times have overlapped when Rose worked in a clinician role. And just recently, somebody said to me, this is the first time that anyone's reached out about family. It was a loved one of a patient, and she made this comment that just always resonates with me. No other place has reached out and asked me how I'm doing. And I'm just wondering, Rose, I think I know the answer, but to kind of lead into our next subject here, is that still going on? Do you still hear that from family members and loved ones?
All the time.
Oh,
And I actually was thinking of an example, and I remember where we were, and a mom said to me, in all of these years that my son has been in treatment, this is the first time that I've been able to see him while in treatment and talk to him.
wow.
And I really appreciate that. And I think that in different capacities, in different environments involving family, we often forget the impact that it has on them. And like from a personal perspective, I'm a caregiver to a 90-year-old father, and I am often forgotten about. So that drives me to do my work even harder, because I know what that's like to feel like there are no supports. So that's important to me. And I've often sat on the phone and just listened to a wife talk for an hour and a half about how this has affected her. And how that helps too. Because if any of our patients are going back to a home where someone's angry, resentful, really burnt out, struggling, that doesn't help them at all. And sometimes people just need a kind ear to listen and to normalize what they're going through and to tell them, you're not crazy. Because I hear people say that, I feel crazy. I feel like no one cares. Does anyone else understand what I'm going through? So, yeah.
And a shout out, I think we can talk a lot about our family support groups that we offer, but those were born right from this podcast, right? So we've had Maureen Kavanaugh on twice and really talking about how isolating it feels to have a loved one with addiction. There's so much stigma, not just on the person with the substance use, but also on the family. We just did a powerful overdose awareness episode with Eileen Lovejoy, who talked really clearly about the lack of support she got when she lost her son. And it's horrifying. And so, we need to find ways to make sure that families know that support can exist because families are going through this path as well. They are, experiencing traumatic experiences, watching their loved one, go through this process. Maureen shares really clearly about there's emerging evidence that the same things that are happening, similar to kind of the urges and cravings that happen for the individual with substance use, there's similar kinds of brain processes happening with loved ones, right? With family and support persons, because you're so scared and so worried that it's traumatic, right? So we know what happens to the brain when traumatic experiences can happen. You're in that constant stress state. You're in a constant state of hypervigilance and not being able to regulate yourself. And that's when, you need to have support and outlets to care for yourself so that when your loved one does come back, you're not still in that stress state, right? Because it makes it that much more difficult.
Yeah. And to that point, just on a personal note, I'm sitting here thinking of my own experience as patient at Spectrum residential program. What seems like just yesterday, but it was actually 15 years ago. And my clinician actually brought in my significant other at the time. Now my wife, but we were really on uncertain, very shaky, uncertain times. And, someone who at that time I probably had known for it was years. It was, a good number of years, but never really. I didn't understand addiction. She didn't understand addiction. We were kind of just like two ships without navigators, just trying to do the best we can. And I'm so forever grateful for my clinician for one, even offering to bring her in, because I didn't know that was an option. And then sitting with us and really explaining some things that, maybe we knew in the back of our mind, but just never came to acknowledge or accept. And I think everyone on this podcast knows, but for those that are out there, we just celebrated 11 years of marriage last month. So it worked out. Happy ending. Yay. But it's not without that family support. It's not without that, intervention at those times. And Lynn, you mentioned the Fast Magnolia Family Support Group, and I'm just wondering if anyone, actually any of us on the podcast can talk about that, but who would like to speak to that and what that is and what the benefit of Fast Magnolia is to everyone involved, the person in recovery and their loved ones.
Want me to take it?
Go for it, Lynn.
So we started this, as Lisa mentioned, Fast Magnolia was founded by Maureen Kavanaugh, and she trained our Spectrum team on really trying to get that family perspective. And I was, and Jesse was in that first round, and Lisa, when we started it. And we're all have clinical backgrounds, and we're very used to jumping into being a clinician. And Maureen was great at saying, that's not what you're doing here. You're not giving therapy. That's not what your role is. You're helping these families. Think of it in the family perspective, not your patient perspective. And you're here to help facilitate. So the model is wonderful. I think it's really helped me to look at the family perspective, but it's a 90-minute group where the first 15 minutes or so really focus on an educational topic, something that people would really benefit from knowing. So, Rose mentioned about communication skills, or we may look at different paths to recovery and what does it look like? What does recovery look like? What does a possible return to use look like? So there's topics every week. After that, we help facilitate just discussion amongst the individuals who join the meetings. It's virtual. We've had people at times from all over the country, a couple times outside of the country, join, in, and really can support one another, talk to the topic, how they experienced it. And in the end, we always save, 10 minutes or so to focus on self-care, whether it's a meditation, or some other tool. It always goes back to, but also, what are you doing for you?
Mm-hmm.
And in the groups where we've had people repeatedly week after week come, you can see they start looking out for each other and saying, how did it go when you talked to your son about that? I was thinking about you this week. And it's really an environment where people feel validated, heard, learn something in the process of it. Because Maureen geared this to, what were the things I wanted to know when my daughter was going through treatment and I didn't have answers to? And so she spent so much time researching and learning because nobody was telling me this. Nobody included this. And that's where we felt it was so important to have that perspective. And we've been doing, at least, is it like 3-4 years now?
Yeah, it's at least 3.
I think it was 3 years just
Yeah.
this past July, I want to say. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Every Wednesday night, right? So if folks are interested, we'll say it again at the end. But if folks are interested or want to share that resource, you could go on our website. You can email, is it
Magnolia Family at spectrumhealthsystems.org.
.org?
Yeah, I think
I just had to look it up for someone, so
It'll
it was
it'll
fresh.
kick right back with the Zoom link. And then you're automatically added to kind of our weekly newsletter, which will tell you the topic and reminder of the Zoom link. But you can come once, you can come every week, you can show up when you want. You don't have to have somebody in treatment at a Spectrum program or a New England Recovery Center program. We've had folks from Canada and from across the country. It's really just an opportunity. It's one of the things that's important to us is, of course, to support the families. That's why we have Rose, right? That's why we have these roles and this focus, of those that are going through our programming. But we also want to support anybody who needs this, right? So it could be, you just are looking for some more information and support. And I just want to add more about what Lynn was sharing is, we want to make sure that the education piece is brief, right? That most of the group is support, right? And that self-care at the end, but that it's accurate, right? Because there's a lot of folklore out there. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of kind of, you must do it this way or not do it that way. And we really are a multiple pathway approach. And I was just in a training at a conference last week where Maureen was with me actually in this session. And, we were listening to the facilitator, kind of the trainer, talk about kind of requiring families to do certain, like an Al-Anon, like a 12-step program, requiring the adolescents in the program to follow one pathway instead of kind of giving more options. And, we both kind of had a bit of a reaction to that because you want to give real information about evidence-based, science-based, but then you want to present options, right? So families have options for ways they can get support, just like our patients have options about ways they can build their own recovery support plan, right? The family can build their own family support plan with lots of different things that you can try.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering, Rose, speaking of the multiple pathways, and what I always say to patients and families, there's no one size fits all cookie cutter approach to this. Is there any, examples of maybe a family or a loved one supporting their person that you've had the privilege of working with that maybe was out of the box, or maybe something you just thought was noteworthy that might benefit someone listening, that like, oh, maybe I didn't think of that, or oh, we can do that to help them or help us? Anything like that in your time as the family engagement specialist come up?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Sorry, I had my coffee this morning, Rose.
That's okay. I haven't
Asking
had
the
my
tough
full one yet.
questions. Oh no.
No, that's a good question. Yes. So I was meeting with a mom and her son is in his 20s. And we often talk about, you cannot fix this, right? And they need to get back to, I think, a relationship that they once had, and they've really gone off course. And I said to her, I'm like, while he's here in treatment, why don't you just talk about something that's very neutral? I said, he is listening to information about addiction, recovery, relapse all day long, being inpatient with us. How about you just talk about Dancing with the Stars, for instance, And she was like, oh, I do that. I do ask him every day what he's learning. And we do talk about addiction. And I said, how about just have a normal conversation so that he feels some sort of normalcy while he's here? Because dance was a huge part of his life. And there's a lot of issue around that, right? There's a lot of feeling. And I said, how about you just reconnect on something that both of you loved? And she was like, and then suddenly the whole conversation in the room also changed.
Yeah.
And their attitude towards one another softened as well. And it may not seem huge, but I think that when folks are here, I often remind them, talk about something that both of you enjoy versus addiction. We both, you both know why you're here, but maybe get back to that original relationship. And you would have thought that the heavens opened and that God spoke, right? Because for me, it wasn't so huge, but for them it was. It was a reminder that, we can talk about normal things, right?
Right. And this addiction in our family is not the only thing.
Right.
Right. Like that person working towards recovery, that son is not only his addiction, and the mom is not only the mother of somebody with addiction, right? Like that they have other things to connect on. It's okay to have spaces, whether it's support groups or education sessions, where everybody gets what they need. That's what we've been talking about for most of this. But it's that, how do we build that connection back that's been really hijacked, right, by this whole process?
And that's a great point you bring up, Rose, that, when I heard you say that, I heard perspective shifting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just focused on the here and now, the crisis mode, the trauma, the often it gets brought up on this podcast and in my daily life, the book The Body Keeps the Score. And I know it was in part of our training as Fast Magnolia family group facilitators. But in it, it talks, often about getting stuck in that trauma cycle and trauma loop, and it's all we can see, and just that simple conversation, like you said, they would have thought it was divine intervention, but it was simply just redirecting, and if somebody's listening and thinking, oh, I gotta focus on this and only this because this is the biggest, situation in my life, it's the biggest problem. Please take care of yourself. Find something that you enjoy, that your loved ones enjoy. I have many fond memories of that campus in Westborough, not only with my personal recovery, but working up at NERC for so many years. And one of my many favorites is for Recovery Month, we would bring in a group of comedians. They were called Addicted to Laughter. And we would put on a comedy show. They didn't want to hear my jokes, but I wanted to hear their jokes. And they would put on a comedy show for the patients. And just like you said, Rose, for that brief period of time, the focus isn't on this clinical group or, my homework from my case manager or my aftercare plan. It's just, okay, I'm gonna be present in the here and now and enjoy myself and actually learn how to have fun again. Right. Because that often can be missed in the whole situation. So we talked about Fast Magnolia. We talked about how to get involved with it. We talked about what your role is up at NERC. I guess the only subject we haven't covered, and please, Lisa, feel free to chime in if I missed something, was just the practical assistance that, Rose, you're giving with families and loved ones, once they leave. Is it like, they walk out the door at NERC and drive down the long driveway and you never talk to them again? Or are there people who, continue to call, or maybe even that you meet with on a longer basis?
I think I'm always talking about FAST. That's I hand out our flyers. I follow up with an email about that. That's always a resource. Also, a lot of times our clients are going on to further treatment as well. And that's something that I talk about in my session of what family resources are also available when you get to your next step. Is it something through your IOP, your PHP? What work can you do to continue these conversations if you're at a halfway house? So it's always talking about that this is just the first step, right? Oftentimes it's one meeting that I have, but you can continue this through X, Y, and Z kind of resources when you leave here. So those are a lot of conversations too, of like, we're not the only place, but how did it feel to start this work together? And sometimes I think once you talk about the elephant in the room, it becomes more comfortable too. So that's a lot of the conversation too that I have with folks.
Yeah, it's really starting that connection. I was just thinking of that, if anybody's heard that just came up at a conference recently, the viral TED Talk from, I think it's Johan Hari, the opposite of addiction is connection. And we talk about that, it's evidence-based. We talk about that all the time. And I love the example you gave earlier, because that's just such a good example, Rose, of like facilitating connection, right? And that we know will build the supports and environment that individuals need to stay and work in recovery. And so that's really the primary goal. The other thing I wanted to touch base on before we end today is kids. I know you support a lot of families and a lot of supervised visits, whether there's, child welfare involved. And, one of the things, Lynn, you said early on in the podcast was, that idea of that 16-year-old who's now an adult nurse who said, wait a minute, this was so supportive to me in a time when I had no control. And it makes me think about that change that we've really been trying to promote, of keeping that connection with your children, particularly for women who often, not always, but often, are the primary caregivers. And, Sesame Street does a lot of really cool stuff in this space, but they build off kind of some trauma informed care perspectives, the 7 C's, if anybody's heard of those, right? So it's, I didn't cause it, I can't control it, I can't cure it, right? So that, like, not fixing it, Rose, that you described, but I can help take care of myself by communicating my feelings, making healthy choices, and celebrating me. And I think adults actually could benefit from those 7 C's, right? Just as much as kids. Can you talk a little bit, Rose, about what you do to support kind of visits with our patients' children?
Yeah. So I have articles on the 7Cs, and I have a different article too on how to talk to kids about addiction. And I often make copies of those for clients, and I leave them out and I say, come and talk to me if you want to get a better sense. So I do a lot of that too around here is how children are affected by addiction, and what we need to be careful with. And that really turns into a very good discussion. What I say to our patients is our sessions with children are going to look a lot different. And one example that I give all the time is I worked with a client who had 5 children, who has 5 children. And we probably had about 4 or 5 weekly visits. This DCF was not involved. And mom came with all the kids, and we went to NERC ATS's backyard and they played. And that was their therapy, because dad was the jungle gym, all 6'4" of him. And they played with dad, and he got sweaty and he was involved with his children. And there was a difference in him that I saw. And I always say that we're not going to talk about addiction with a 5-year-old. We're going to sit and have that relationship with your child. And that's really important. And I see how they play with their parents and how they get involved, and a change that comes over them, and how their children are motivation for them. So when we have DCF visits, that looks different because DCF is also there. And so I'm able to do some different things when it's just us and watching them play, and explaining that is therapy and that is therapeutic to be able to just talk with your kids. And then as they get older, I've had, teenagers and young adults come in and say, this is what addiction's done to me. And we have those conversations as well. And also we talk about their resilience and what they're learning. But a lot of times I make sure to stress how the parents are being role models of when you have a problem, you get help and you ask for help, and it's okay to do so. And what you're teaching your children being here. Because I think there's so much guilt and shame that they don't see the role they're playing in being role models to their children as well.
And Lynn, I'd love to hear your kind of historical perspective. This is another thing that's changed over time that we're really trying to change. It used to be that you'd be like, you know what, parents, you go take care of your substance use, take care of your addiction in a black box over here with no access to your children, right? And that actually can cause more harm than good. People might not choose to come to treatment because of that, or we know that connection is just as important to kids as it is to the parents, right? That's where repair happens. That's where that support happens. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how that's evolved over time?
Sure. And I think particularly, and again, as we've said, it's not that there aren't many men that might be sole caregivers, but if you think of the stigma for women, particularly who have an addiction, and it was kind of the statement of, you can't take care of anybody till you take care of yourself. So go into treatment. And for a lot of women, disconnecting with their children was definitely a barrier to getting treatment, and then living within that continued cycle, and maybe getting to the point where they lose custody of their children, which they didn't want. And so we want to include family members as much as possible. We're trying to connect. In that same way as we've continued to talk, the more you do that, I think without even realizing it, you're helping the next generation. You're really helping with these connections, helping to learn to communicate, and maybe we'll break some of the cycles in families. I think a big part of what we continue to give is to say there's hope, and that's what people need to grab onto, even if it's not right there immediately. There's hope moving forward. The more there's programs, it's not always easy to do, that include, women or families together. The better the outcomes are, because they're all there and getting support at the same time. So there's some family programs. There might be, other women and children, with women who are pregnant, and having that support. But the more we can do to support the family system together, certainly the better. I think when you talk about the old days of, like maybe in a year you'll be able to deal with this, and you'll see them then, go into long-term care. And sometimes that worked, but the more we can do to support the entire unit, the more the person's likely to stay in treatment, and as well. So certainly I hope we're in a better direction with that moving forward. But Rose, like you said, the elephant in the room, sometimes that needs to really be talked about. The other part of it is also recognizing, where sometimes an individual has ambivalence about moving forward, sometimes families do. They're not always on the same page. So sometimes the person's like, I'm gung ho. I don't know why they're still so angry with me, or they don't want to participate. And so it's continuing to have those conversations. So there's some connection that's being made. I haven't used now in 90 days, and why are they still so angry with me, and questioning? And it's helping both perspectives to understand where each is coming from and validating each experience. The family has a very valid reason for why they are feeling the way they are, as well as the individual. So I'm sure that is the kind of discussion you're having all the time as well.
I really appreciate that perspective of like the ripple effect that happens when we include families and supports, that it has that impact on not just the person that we're caring for, but their supports, their loved one, their children, right? We know so much more about the impact of trauma on children. And one of those things is traumatic separation.
Yes.
Right. So often our patients have periods of incarceration, which that adds another layer of traumatic separation, which is harder to navigate. But treatment can be a time of kind of traumatic separation. And we know the opposite, and the ways to support through that is connection, right? And really just that impact, that if we're supporting the person and the family, including the kids, including everyone in their circle, we're actually helping whole families and communities heal and get better.
I also talk about the grief and loss that's experienced. And one time I was doing an informational session at our detox, and I said, it's important to remember that your families are also dealing with grief, and they're dealing with loss. And you don't need to be deceased for families to experience the loss of who you were, who they thought you would become. And a patient looked at me and said, oh my God, I've never thought of it from that perspective. And I'm like, because we often think of grief and loss as the person's no longer here, right, in body. But a lot of times it's your spirit is not there. And often I will ask family members or friends or whoever is in our session, like, I say, this person better than I do. What do you love about this person? What do you miss about this person? And that's when the tears start. Because it really comes down to, like, I miss everything we used to do as mother and daughter, right? I miss X, Y, and Z. So there's that loss. And we as Americans don't always deal with that very well, right? Or we don't know how to deal with grief and loss. So when I put it in that perspective, I could see the wheels turning a lot of times with our patients of, oh, yeah. Or for children, right? That loss of a parent and not understanding, why isn't mom here?
Yeah. And often it's that, like, both anticipatory loss, that fear of like what could happen, right? It hasn't happened yet, but it could. And even that kind of ambiguous loss, like what would my loved one have been able to accomplish at this point had addiction not entered the picture, right? Like what might have been. And it's about kind of recognizing and validating those feelings of loss, and then building the connection for what now is possible, right? Because we all know, right, that recovery is possible.
Very
And
possible.
yeah, it might be a different path than was laid out when you were 10, but it might still
Yeah.
be a wonderful path. Yeah.
And what a great example of that Lynn told of the nurse. It's not lost on me, Lynn, that this person was 16 in one of those groups and then grows up to become part of the caring profession in human services herself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Very true.
well, I know I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I can talk family engagement all day. Thank you so much, Rose and Lynn, for joining us today and talking with us.
And if you need
You.
support, please reach out. We'd love to have you join, on the fast groups. You don't have to speak if you don't want to, or you can, like, it's, just come and get and feel the support, show up. It's on Zoom, right? So it's accessible, super easy. We really encourage folks to join. We don't charge anything. We just offer this, right? We just offer it. We just facilitate it. Really to help others and to spread the support beyond just those that we care for.
And on that note, Lisa, I might have misspoke earlier, so I just wanted to share that if you are interested in Fast Magnolia, the email to reach out is magnolia@spectrumhealthsystems.org. I've only been doing this for 3 years, but occasionally we forget the email. So like Lisa said, you email that, and then you get the bounce back Zoom link, and then you get the reminder each week of each topic that we will be discussing.
Yeah.
So
you can get it on our website and other places too.
Yep.
We often post it on our social media pages. So, don't worry if you didn't get it. If you wrote the wrong one down or you get the wrong, you can find us.
Just like multiple pathways to treatment, multiple pathways to Fast Magnolia.
Yes.
So
Thanks so much, Jesse.
thank you, everybody. Thank
Rose.
you, Rose and Lynn. This has been so enjoyable. And like we always say, like, subscribe, check us out wherever you like podcasts, and we will be back next week to continue Recovery Month.
On community, right? Which is such a great transition from family and support to community. So thank you very much. All right. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Bye.